Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 21, The Rise of the Mayors. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, following the deaths of Guntram and Childebert, the three kingdoms were ruled by children, although Fredegund was regent for her son Clothar in Neustria, and Brunhild was regent for her grandsons Theodebert in Austrasia and Theodoric in Burgundy. In theory, Theodebert and Theodoric could have combined against Clothar, but the brothers were more interested in fighting each other. Eventually, Theodoric allied with Clothar against his older brother and gained control of both Burgundy and Austrasia after killing Theodebert. While Clothar had gained some lands, he knew that Theodoric would soon decide to unite Greater Frankia under a single king, who would be named Theodoric. However, Theodoric died of something, leaving Brunhild regent for her great-grandson. Unfortunately, several powerful nobles in Austrasia decided that it was time for new leadership and allied with Clothar. Brunhild was executed, and Clothar became king of Greater Frankia. It appeared that Frankia would remain united since Clothar's son Dagobert refused to share power with his brother, but Dagobert died relatively young. The two kingdoms were now ruled by two boys. The key nobles in each king's court had no desire for a war, so little changed other than the respective mayors of the palace no longer had to worry about a king looking over their shoulders or checking their accounts. Nantachildis, the king's widow, was initially quite influential in Neustria and ensured that when the position of mayor became open in 642, it went to her candidate. Austrasia was managed by Bishop Schunebert and Pippin, who had managed to regain his position as mayor of the palace. While Pippin had been preparing his son Grimoald to succeed him as mayor, the position went to another candidate when Pippin died. So Grimoald and his allies made sure that the position became vacant. After his recently deceased predecessor was buried, Grimoald became mayor. Even Burgundy saw a bloody battle between the followers of two claimants of the position of mayor. Why hadn't the Visigoths taken advantage of the instability to expand north? Well, no Visigoth king managed to rule for long, each lasting only a few years, partially because the Visigoths would not follow a child and did not seem capable of appointing a regent. Actually, the failure of any Visigoth king to establish a dynasty highlights the difference between the Franks and both the Visigoths and the Lombards. Namely, the Franks' fixation on legitimacy based on the bloodline of Clovis. This dynasty became known as the Merovingians, and the kings strengthened this legitimacy by refusing to marry other powerful Frankish families. Instead, their wives came from outside Frankia, often from the Visigoths. If they had made marriage alliances with powerful families within Frankia, then those families would have had a claim to the throne. However, the Merovingian dynasty was weakening. While Grimoald had managed to succeed his father as mayor of Austrasia, there was no guarantee that Sigebert's successor would want to keep his father's advisor. Fortunately, an opportunity to establish a dynasty appeared. Having failed to produce an heir, King Sigebert agreed to, or was forced to adopt Grimoald's son Childebert as heir. However, Sigebert's queen finally gave birth to a son, Dagobert, which eliminated the need to obtain an heir outside of the family. Even though there was now a legitimate heir, when Sigebert died in 656, only 27, Grimoald somehow convinced the clergy to send Dagobert to Ireland and placed his son Childebert on the throne of Austrasia. Clearly, Grimoald felt secure if he made such a bold move. More accurately, Grimoald had taken a major gamble, but he felt that the throne was worth the risk. In the end, the risk was greater than he had thought. Sigebert's brother Clovis II and his advisors saw an opportunity to reunite the two kingdoms. Lured into Neustria, both Grimoald and Childebert were killed. Clovis was now able to reunite the two kingdoms, but he died a year later, and his wife Brunhild, an Anglo-Saxon slave, ruled as regent for her son Clothar III. Her second son, Childeric II, was made king of Austrasia. Once Clothar was old enough to rule, Brunhild retired to a monastery in 664. While she may not have embraced the early retirement, a comfortable life in a monastery was preferable to the other option of being torn apart by horses in public. Since Austrasia and Neustria each had a king, there was a possibility that they would return to being separate kingdoms. However, Clothar died young in 673, like a surprising number of men in his family, and the nobles of Neustria and Burgundy asked his younger brother Childeric to rule them as well. Since there was a third brother, Theodoric, there was another option, but Childeric might have been fixated on reuniting Frankia. Anyway, he had succeeded. Well, at least until he was assassinated because he listened to his advisors from Austrasia rather than the local nobles in Neustria. Although Childeric was succeeded by his younger brother Theodoric, Austrasia lacked a king. Since there were no other descendants of Clovis alive, the only option for Austrasia was to accept rule by Theodoric as well. Actually, there was another Merovingian alive, although a little bit of detective work was needed to find him. Hoping to avoid forced reunification with Neustria, a number of nobles turned to a cousin of the late kings, so Sigebert's son Dagobert II was brought back from Ireland and crowned King of Austrasia in 676. Honestly, he most likely was an impostor since he had been sent away 11 years ago when he was still a child. He appears to have been installed as king to legitimize Pippin II as mayor. Who was Pippin II, you ask? The nephew of Grimoald. Pippin was the new leader of a family that had become comfortable ruling as the power behind the throne and saw an opportunity. I need to stress that Pippin and his family were extremely patient since his uncle Grimoald had been assassinated 2 decades earlier. While sources from this period are naturally limited, this is especially true of the brief reign of Dagobert II because no monk chose to defend him and no relative wanted to pay to ensure that he was remembered. Also, he only ruled for 3 years and was undoubtedly a figurehead and possibly not even Dagobert. So he disappeared into obscurity after he was assassinated by someone in 679, leaving Pippin in charge of Austrasia, although he lacked a king. Again. While Pippin waited patiently in Austrasia, Neustria was ruled by a succession of mayors until one of them provoked a conflict with the Austrasians. This time, Pippin moved carefully, gaining enough support to win a complete victory over the Neustrians in 687 at the Battle of Tertry, becoming the dominant power in the two kingdoms. It is worth stressing that the kings had become figureheads by this time. Pippin soon married the widow of his rival mayor and took the position of mayor as well. Still, Pippin focused on his base in Austrasia, gaining lands and monasteries for his family. It is worth briefly reviewing the recent history of the Franks. Clothar II, the great-grandson of Clovis, had reunited the kingdoms within Greater Frankia in 613, although he had needed the help of powerful nobles in the other kingdoms. Still, his authority had not been challenged by those nobles. A little over 70 years later, his descendants had become figureheads. It is probably best to describe the period between 613 and 617 as an endless series of murders and battles between rival families struggling to forcibly unite the two separate kingdoms of Neustria and Austrasia. While it seems inevitable now that the Merovingians would lose power to their mayors and eventually be overthrown, it was not obvious as it happened. When a string of weak Merovingian kings appeared for a few decades during the end of the 7th century, noble families fought each other to be the power behind the throne. The family of Pippin I barely survived the civil war and spent 25 years on the outskirts of power before making a comeback. When Pippin regained control of Frankia at the Battle of Tertry in 687, technically he was merely fighting a rival mayor, since Theodoric III remained on the throne of Neustria. Clearly, Theodoric trusted Pippin since he granted his new mayor the right to control the judicial court, the governance of the entire kingdom, control over the treasury, and command of the army. Either Theodoric was obsessed with a hobby, or he had accepted that the position of figurehead was better than the alternative. Remember, Pippin's uncle had already placed his son, Pippin's cousin, on the throne, and it was unlikely that Pippin had more reverence for the Merovingian dynasty. Basing himself in Austrasia, Pippin placed his sons Grimoald and Drogo in the mayoral palaces of Neustria and Burgundy, respectively. Anstrud, the daughter of the former mayor of Neustria, even married Drogo. The other son, Grimoald, made a marriage alliance with the daughter of the ruler of Frisia. Honestly, these sound like the marriage alliances of a king, not a mayor. Theodoric does not seem to have been a dynamic king, but Pippin benefited from a high turnover of kings. Theodoric died in 691 and was replaced by the infant Clovis IV, who lasted 4 years before he was succeeded by his younger brother Childebert III. Since Childebert was young, he needed an advisor, so Pippin made a recommendation, his son Grimoald. While Pippin's family appeared to have a stranglehold on the royal government, it is unclear whether Childebert even resented the family's control. He may have recognized that the combined kingdom was too large to rule alone. Maybe Pippin and his son always paid respect to the king in public. Honestly, there had not been a decisive Merovingian king who actually ruled in decades, probably more than a generation. By that time, few people remembered Clothar II, if any. Most people quite likely thought that the kings had always been figureheads. There was no clear moment when the kings lost power, and the transfer likely took place over decades, but it definitely occurred. Just the records are too limited to be certain. All that is known is that the main territories of Greater Frankia were peaceful, and none displayed any desire to exit Greater Frankia. Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy were united under a single king, Childebert III. Then he died in 711, and his son Dagobert III ruled until 715. Life expectancy was not high at that time, but that many deaths seems strange. The rise of the mayors began in 639, and there is no denying that a sizable amount of blood was spilled. The 2 decades leading up to the climactic battle at Tertry in 687 were especially bloody. Childeric II was murdered by Neustrian nobles in 675, and then another king was killed by Austrasian nobles 4 years later. However, the violence appeared to have occurred in brief spurts. While the period was undoubtedly tense, most peasants were probably able to get on with their daily struggle to gather enough food to survive another winter without worrying about armed thugs in the service of one noble burning their farms to make a point to another noble. In fact, the economy seems to have grown. The crown did not publish annual statistics, so the exact figures are unknown. But new trade centers developed in ports on the Frankish coast, especially Quentovic south of Boulogne and Dorestad near modern-day Utrecht. Ships would cross the channel to trade with the growing commercial centers along the southern and eastern coast of England. Some ships even made the more lengthy and dangerous trip to Scandinavia. Okay, so the next question is, what did they trade? Again, records are limited, but a side effect of the spread of Christianity was the spread of monasteries. When Christianity became more strictly controlled by the papacy, monasteries would be centers of prayer. But in this period, monasteries were able to focus their resources into more efficient agriculture. A similar process was taking place in the estates of the nobles, and this process of production for commerce rather than survival intensified during the stability created or imposed, depending on your interpretation, by Pippin. Monasteries and nobles could afford to build watermills and purchase better plows, so they produced a surplus of food, which left them with disposable income, so they bought luxury goods, which were produced by artisans living in towns. Around this time, kingdoms were emerging in England, which had sufficient stability to produce surplus goods, thus fostering international trade. Admittedly, this international trade was predominantly cross-channel trade, but in a period where travel was genuinely difficult, this would have been viewed as international trade. Again, the amount of trade was undoubtedly a tiny fraction of the trade during the Roman Empire, but something was emerging. I really need to stress that the key point of this period is not which Childebert or Childeric lasted longer. Honestly, there is little information available to make them come to life as personalities. Good, bad, greedy, incompetent, anything really. The Merovingian period is hard to understand because the rapid turnover of kings and mayors naturally makes it a complicated period, but the situation is made worse by the scarcity of documents. Gregory of Tours produced a detailed history, but it ends in the mid-590s. Very few monks had the time and interest to produce a record of this period until Charlemagne funded a lot of monks. Even then, they focused on the mayors, who were the ancestors of their patron. Okay, Pippin had firm control of Greater Frankia. What was the neighborhood like? Actually, the endless civil wars had enabled Aquitaine to finally free itself from Frankish domination. Duke Lupus had led the successful revolt, but clearly hoped to avoid antagonizing the Franks since he refused to call himself king. Brittany was autonomous because it was hard to reach, while Bavaria retained its autonomy simply because it was further away. Still, Aquitaine was distant and not a direct threat. A more serious problem was the Frisians, who were based around the Rhine Delta, primarily the trade center at Dorestad. Merchants and pirates, they traded and raided along the channel. This threat predated Pippin's reign, but he was better prepared to deal with it. Several campaigns into Frisia ended the threat of raids and enabled him to reward Austrasian nobles with grants of land in Frisia. Actually, the expansion into Frisia probably helped keep the peace within Greater Frankia. Pippin invested a great deal of effort in converting the Frisians, enlisting Willibrord, a Northumbrian monk who was appointed Archbishop of the Frisians by the Pope. Using Frisia as a base, Willibrord's Anglo-Saxon disciples attempted to convert the Saxons, but their message does not appear to have been well received, since two of them became martyrs. King Radbod of Frisia may have been defeated, but he refused baptism. However, he allowed the baptism of his daughter, who became one of Grimoald's several wives. While the conversion process in Frisia was bumpy, Pippin had solidified his control in Frankia by establishing monasteries and abbeys, either directly or through relatives like his mother and sister-in-law, thus ensuring that the leading churchman in the kingdom would be dependent on his family's patronage. Frankia was largely at peace, but the succession would prove challenging since both of Pippin's legitimate sons had died. Actually, Grimoald had been murdered, so Pippin's rule in Neustria was not entirely firm. While his legitimate sons may have died, he still had two illegitimate sons. Instead, he chose his grandson, 6-year-old Theodald, which was apparently recommended by his legitimate wife Pletrude, who hoped to govern in her grandson's name. It is important to remember that Pippin had depended on her family's support to gain control of Frankia. Pippin made this decision shortly before he died on December 16, 714. To sum up, Duke Pippin had become mayor of the Palace of Austrasia due to his help overthrowing Brunhild and was succeeded by his son Grimoald. However, Grimoald overreached when he put his own son on the throne rather than the legitimate son of the recently deceased king and was killed by the king's brother Clovis. Austrasia and Neustria were briefly reunited until Clovis died young and the two kingdoms were divided between his two sons. Since both kings were children, the mayors became the powers behind the throne. Grimoald's nephew Pippin II became the mayor of Austrasia and then won a decisive victory against the Neustrians at Tertry, reuniting Greater Frankia. Pippin retained control of the kingdoms of Greater Frankia for several decades, while a series of weak kings served as figureheads. Given the lack of an adult heir, a smooth succession was unlikely. However, the situation had changed dramatically in Hispania, so I will discuss the existential threat faced by the Visigoths next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.